This episode is brought to you by Sacred Rites, which provides support, resources, and networks for religion scholars committed to translating their research to a broader audience. You can find more information about their work at sacred-rites.org. You are listening to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Ira Helderman for a return visit to the show. If you want to hear his first appearance where we discuss his 2019 book, Prescribing the Dharma, from the University of North Carolina Press, please listen to episode number 129 of this show. Dr. Ira Helderman is Adjunct Professor of Religion, Psychology, and Culture at Vanderbilt University and studies how psychotherapists' definitions of what is and is not religious shape their understandings of caregiving, health, and illness. Dr. Helderman is also a practicing psychotherapist and clinical supervisor who has worked in the mental health field for over 20 years in a variety of clinical settings, from inpatient addiction treatment centers and psychiatric hospitals to his current private practice. On this episode, we discuss Helderman's current project studying the widespread psychotherapeutic use of Buddhist meditation. Though meditation is often described by patients as a way of easing spiritual yearning, it can generate adverse effects like agitation, traumatic memories, and hallucinations. We dive deeper into these topics in the episode. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Ira Helderman. Dr. Ira Helderman, welcome back to Classical Ideas.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me back.
I'm delighted that you're here. The last time you were here was, if listeners want to know, you were on episode 129 on August 10th, 2019, closing in on 7 years ago, talking about Prescribing the Dharma, your book. But to start, we'll kind of touch base on that a little bit in a moment, but just refresh listeners. Can you introduce yourself just a little bit and describe your work, what you do, so that people can get a sense of what your life is like at the intersection of psychotherapy and religious studies?
I'm Dr. Ira Helderman, and I am my day job is what I typically call it is as a psychotherapist in private practice, a counselor. And however, at a certain point of my career as a therapist, I got bit by the academic bug, became really interested in religious studies, and that came directly out of my work as a counselor and interest in mindfulness-based psychotherapies and in exploring those. We're reading about folks saying that they had origins in Buddhist traditions, to start exploring Buddhist traditions, and then got curious about what was going on there, and went back for a whole other degree, a PhD in religious studies in religion and psychology. And my first project, my first book, came directly out of that, curiosity that again stemmed initially from my work as a counselor, and in the way, and it looked at how therapists related to Buddhist traditions. And so that in terms of today, as I say, I really do, sit at the intersection of religion and psychotherapy, because it really is my day job. I do primarily, my days are filled with clinical sessions, but I also do teach for Vanderbilt University here in Nashville. For primarily, my primary home is the Department of Religious Studies. I also teach for the Divinity School and have taught here recently for our number one major, because all our pre-med students major in it, and it's a really unique, amazing program called Medicine, Health, and Society. While most of my days are taken up with clinical sessions, I'm also teaching and continuing to do research and publishing.
Well, we did speak in 2019 about that book, and I love the subtitle of that book as well, Psychotherapists, Buddhist Traditions, and Defining Religion, from University of North Carolina Press. What did you enjoy about the aftermath of that book's release? Did you do anything special for it? What did you enjoy about the months and years after the book came out?
Yeah, the initial, excitement of the publication was really fun, and getting to do, book release events and conversations like ours. And, since then, it's been really interesting seeing what's happened to prescribing the Dharma, psychotherapists, Buddhist traditions, and defining religion. First, it's been interesting just because back to my identity. I think that because I am a therapist, I think that people who haven't read the book but just know of its existence kind of assume that it's, primarily for other therapists, and, that it's written from a place of a therapist talking about, maybe how you relate Buddhist traditions and psychotherapy. And, that's not what the book does really at all. I mean, hopefully it's helpful for clinicians because I believe that, understanding, history and thinking about some of the underlying what concepts and what assumptions we might be making that underlie like our just everyday work. I hope that's important. The book really is a history and a ethnography, in quotes, autoethnography. It isn't until the very end of the book that I even kind of like bring in a clinical, more of a clinical vignette. So I think that there's been sort of an assumption that the book is doing something different than it does, but it still gets, I think that people end up picking it up, maybe, nonetheless, and that maybe because of that, and hopefully they're finding something more. That last phrase there, defining religion, is the one that, I was most interested in, and it is the one that's still the hardest to get for people to sort of pick up on. The idea that we continue to sort of debate. I continue to hear people debate. Is this all the secularization of Buddhist traditions? Is this actually a new Buddhist form? Is it the transmission of, is it a new form of a new Buddhist school that's being created here? And so is it actually a religion that we're talking about? And all of that, takes what is religious and what is not religious on its own terms without saying, well, wait a minute, what we're actually talking about here is how people define what is and is not religious. And so that's something I continue to be invested in exploring.
Wonderful. Well, I know you're part of a writing group, a working group with Sacred Rites right now. Tell me a little bit about the Templeton Foundation working group that you're in right now and what you're enjoying about that.
So one of the coolest things, I guess I will share that one of the coolest things about this group is that it found me. That group was already together, and had already kind of found each other to start, to come to a group of scholars from a variety of different disciplines. And it's an important thing. So there's anthropologists of religion, sociologists of religion, people that do more history, as I, I'm very interested personally in doing. And so from different sort of disciplinary perspectives and also different subject areas. So, but with all sort of the common ground being that whether interested in Hindu traditions and yoga practices or Buddhist traditions and meditation and mindfulness, or plant medicine and indigenous religion, whatever the background, is this idea of spiritual borrowing, which, is just one phrase to describe what, there have been many kind of phrases and terms, that have been used to describe the idea that you have one community adopting, using, experimenting with elements from another community. And what the ethics of that are when you have communities of power who have more power, maybe appropriating or adopting, it's borrowing from communities with less power. And that's where a phrase like cultural appropriation comes in. It sort of signals that ethical problem. Each of us are working on different areas. There's a few of us working on, the more than one yoga, person working on yoga practices or meditation and mindfulness practices, plant medicine, and so on. So.
Well, you have a broad project on how psychotherapists are approaching what you call adverse meditation experiences. I'd love to know kind of about the just the overall overview of the project that you are currently focused on about these meditation experiences. What sparked it for you?
my current project is actually, there's a one way of looking at it that it's a more kind of specialized or more focused area of the previous project. And there's another way has it more expansive. So while I was looking at, in prescribing the Dharma, kind of diversity of ways that psychotherapists have approached, Buddhist teachings and practices, as a whole, as a large or arguably large source, because they were, the fact is the therapists I was looking at were looking at only a little slice of all the Buddhist teaching and practices for the most part. But in any case, this looks at kind of one strand there. Number one, this concept, of meditation, capital M, singular term, the diversity of meditation practices, and then their effects. And the idea that there could be psi practitioners increasing attention to the idea that meditation practices can have adverse effects, can people can have challenging, even distressing, disruptive experiences using meditation and practices, and how they've responded to that over time, as a way of opening up to. So that's a more specific topic, but what it gets to is this much larger topic, which is how therapists distinguish between religious experience in quotes there, and mental illness or psychopathology.
Excellent. Well, what are adverse meditation effects? Like, just describe what that concept is. And maybe if you want to bring in meditation sickness as well, which I saw in another piece of your work, tell me a little bit about these terms.
So maybe I'll start with what the average person might think of as a undesirable meditation effect or unpleasant meditation effect, which is a particular, just notice the language there, because I'll come back to that. Anyone that's meditated has probably experienced some discomfort while meditating. That if you sit in meditation for long enough, you're going to experience some physical discomfort. Your back might start to get too sore, or your foot might fall asleep. Or you might feel just a sense of, boredom or agitation, waiting for the time to go by. So if we talk about just unpleasant meditation experiences in a really broad sense, probably everyone's experienced that to a certain extent. And those things may not be assessed for, and people may not, if they're researching meditation, they may not ask about those things. But it goes, if we do put it on a spectrum, the unpleasantness can increase from there. So people who might go on a multi-day meditation retreat, might find themselves having difficulty sleeping at night, even though they thought it was going to be relaxing. They lay down to sleep after hours of meditating all day and focusing on their breath, and they try to just relax, but they find themselves still focusing on their breath, and next thing you know, they're experiencing sleep disruption. Or they may leave that meditation retreat and having, been for days, like kind of in the woods and in silence, and they feel kind of, hyperstimulated coming out of that. Most people experience some degree of that. And there are side practitioners who, are studying each of these pieces. So there's a recent piece that came out on light sensitivity, audio sensitivity. The people just come out of a meditation retreat and they just, feel overstimulated by light or sound as they're returning to their lives. And it can get more intense from there, where people are meditating, they start to feel flooded by traumatic memories. They start to feel kind of like, not just mindfully observing their experience, but so detached from their experience that they feel like they're not in it anymore. Therapists will refer to that as depersonalization. They'll see kind of the impermanence of all things, maybe, or just start to feel really depressed and down. They'll hear things and see things that other people around them aren't hearing or seeing in a disturbing way, or they feel they haven't slept for some days and feel like they don't need sleep anymore, and maybe don't even want to sleep because they don't want to dilute the intensity of the connection and sense of oneness that they're experiencing, in the sense that maybe they have a direct line now, having broken through some level of contemplative attainment, some direct line to divinities, and people around them hear them say that when they return back to their lives and feel very concerned that they might be, a typical therapist might diagnose that person as having a manic episode with psychotic features. So it's a full, it can, the adverse experiences can get so intense that people have died by suicide, related to returning from a meditation retreat, extremely, with their lives extremely disturbed and disrupted.
Hmm. That's actually really interesting. I haven't heard any of those examples, but so I didn't know about that. But I know in the last like 10, 15 years, there's been a huge rise in the use of meditation practices in therapeutic settings. And I'm wondering if the popularity of therapeutic meditation has raised any concerns among psychologists or clinicians. Like, are there any like concerns or downsides that you all are noticing in the field?
Yes. Can I say one more thing on the last question,
Of
though?
course.
Yeah, because the last thing I would just say is that, like, as I was talking, you may have noticed that I was like shifting in and out of what kind of descriptive language I was using, and just to say that, if we call something, unpleasant or uncomfortable, that's one way of framing it. If we call it, adverse meditation experience effects, just to answer that question, adverse meditation effects comes directly from a kind of biomedical way of describing meditation, right? If you are evaluating, a medication, for its use, you're going to look at its therapeutic effects, but you're also going to look for its side effects, including adverse side effects. And so that's where that language of adverse meditation effects comes from. It comes directly from from its therapeutic kind of usages. Meanwhile, you asked about meditation sickness, and just to, meditation sickness is a English translation of a Buddhist concept. Dates back some centuries. The idea of Shanbing, the idea that people, can get sick from meditation. In terms of the question you're asking, yes, this is what we can say for sure. There has been this huge boom in research studies. Research may be shifting to other things like psychedelics, and there's, overlap there. That's kind of interesting. But there has been a boom in interest in the use of meditation practices, including for therapeutic purposes. Psy practitioners, research psychologists, clinical therapists, including social workers, counselors like myself, they there's been increasing, usages of meditation practices, especially mindfulness practices. So much so that, I regularly meet people who only know of something like mindfulness as a therapeutic intervention and don't really, maybe have only a vague sense of it being spiritual in some way, if any. So it's if people that have expressed concern about the medicalization of these practices, like to a certain extent they may have been sort of completed, but as more and more research studies have attended to the positive effects of meditation practices and especially mindfulness practices, a growing number of psy practitioners became concerned. Well, what about the potential side effects and adverse effects? There is sort of in my mind, a sort of a watershed kind of moment as a historian when I think about kind of this history of these of meditation studies. And a piece came out in 2018. If it publishes in 2018, it's been worked on for some years before that by a cohort of therapists and psych practitioners, actually mostly research psychologists, called Mind the Hype. That was, warning about the hype and popularity of mindfulness practices. One of the things that they warned most about was, in the hype, we may be missing the potential adverse effects. And people may, unknowingly take up these practices and then expose themselves to those adverse effects. And a number of my research participants, people that I've interviewed for my current research, were part of this cohort. People like Nicholas Van Dam, Willoughby Britton. So yes, as meditation and mindfulness practices have gained more popularity, especially for therapeutic purposes, people have started to tune into their potential adverse effects.
One of the publications you released from this project is called Meditation Madness from the journal Culture and Religion. I would like to know about some major examples that are in that piece that you feel like listeners should know about that you highlight in that article.
So yes, as I was just sharing about that increased popularity and thus the increased attention to adverse effects, again, in proportion, the studies on adverse effects still remain just small in comparison to the attention to the positive effects. So that you yourself had said, oh, I didn't know about that, and that's interesting. That's interesting to me in its own right, because major popular media has covered this. The New York Times, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, the, you know, and that's another piece actually that I wrote about called Mindful of the Media, that you have, I wrote my own popular piece that kind of, with they let me use the headline I pitched to get at this, which is that everyone's talking about how nobody's talking about the risks of meditation. But it just speaks to just how much positive attention it gets, that it's hard to make it, to come through that, so that for you to have heard of it. People have expressed, one of those New York Times articles that has expressed concern about, the social adverse effects, if not clinical adverse effects, of the popularity of meditation. Was called Meditation Madness. That's where my article, my academic journal article piece comes from. And the idea is that, they're referring to it as madness, like, meditation is a fad. It's like, but it also kind of connects to this idea that as people have gone mad for meditation, are taking it up, or in a kind of maybe superficial way, or even a frenzied kind of way, as a panacea for everything, that's itself could be dangerous. So with that article, and I appreciate you naming it, because I would love for people to look more at it, because religious studies scholars for a long time have had this category called popular religion. And what they're meaning by that is speaking to kind of a difference between, the way that people, popular, religion is practiced, like the masses practice religious, versus the way elites practice religion. And that was like an old kind of binary that religious studies scholars have tried to let go of to a certain extent. But because there's sort of an old there's a genealogy to how the masses are looked at, and how, like, the popular masses are looked at as uneducated. And what I try to get at in this piece is how what people are concerned about today may be connected to some of these older forms, without trying to, go into the whole argument of the piece here. As one of my interviewees kind of put it, was, sort of unsupervised religion, that there
Hmm.
may be a place for trained practitioners, for, if not elite, but knowledgeable people that kind of can guide somebody through these practices, can warn about their possible adverse effects, as people are kind of afraid that, like, in the democratization of mindfulness practices, as they've spread, people are just going on their picking up their cell phone, their smartphone, and using an app without knowing that there could be these adverse effects. And one of my research participants, Willoughby Britton, has actually consulted for some of these apps to try to mitigate this, to speak to this. But people are generally just kind of concerned that, like, if everyone's doing it without any guidance, without any supervision, as we'll say, it could open them up to real madness, and not just people being mad for it, for meditation.
Gotcha. Tell me a little bit more about the cultural appropriation aspect. Whenever you were talking about Templeton earlier, I know you said the word culture, the term cultural appropriation. How does that fit within this larger project on like meditation related, like distresses or madness or adverse effects? How does cultural appropriation fit in here?
So, one thing that I've kind of sort of gestured to here that I'm interested in an overarching way is, again, so you have psi practitioners, who are and that's PSY, psychological practitioners, of the psi disciplines, who are concerned about these adverse effects as like health effects. But you also have a burgeoning body of literature that express concern about meditation practices having adverse societal effects, essentially. That the boom in their use, the way that they're being used, is adverse for communities, for society as a whole, or is unethical in certain ways. And one of those critiques has been that it is cultural appropriate. The way that mindfulness practices in particular have taken off is a case of cultural appropriation, where you have predominantly, people of European descent, in positions of power and authority, stripping the cultural resources from, less, disempowered communities, Asian communities, religious minorities, Buddhist communities, of their resources, and then taking them and repurposing them in an instrumental way, using modernity's science and biomedical frames, and that there's something unethical about that is a case of cultural appropriation. I have a new piece that's it looks to be, our working group got asked to do a special issue of a journal called the Journal of Religious Ethics, and it's still under peer review, so who knows, maybe my piece will be the one that doesn't make it into the special issue, for all I know. But my piece looks at this idea that is psychotherapists' mindfulness practices a case of cultural appropriation from a few different angles. And the working title of that piece is, can cultural appropriation make the appropriator sick? And other questions weighing the positive and adverse effects of psychotherapists, mindfulness. That question is, I think, what your question gets to. Although it's just one of the questions I explore in the piece in terms of weighing the positive and adverse effects, because there is this, one theory for what these, adverse meditation experiences are, is that it's kind of caused by cultural appropriation. It's kind of a strange sort of ideology, that what's happening is, because adverse meditation effects have largely been studied by, again, people of European descent in communities of European descent. The idea is that, well, these practices are, come from communitarian, I'm putting in quotes, contexts, that are intended for ego dissolution. They're intended to, help people to realize the impermanence of the self, of the individual bounded self. And you have people who are in this very individualistic society of the U.S. using these practices for self improvement, or for self purposes, but instead finding them experiencing these depersonalizing experiences, to misuse the terms to make the point, and find that deeply ungrounding. And they're experiencing these adverse effects because of a clash of cultures, or a dissonance between cultural assumptions. It's the appropriation itself, and in recontextualizing it and using it against its own purposes, that might cause somebody to get sick. And that's a really interesting idea to think about if we take it, outside of just these practices, and I try to explore again without trying to reproduce the whole article here. That's some of what I explore in the piece.
Across the project, you emphasize that judgments about harm and risk and benefits are kind of value laden. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why that is important for us to recognize as we think about the topic of your research.
Ultimately, what that question gets at is sort of a uh, maybe the heart of the project. I do have a working title. We talked about meditation sickness, and my working title for what will hopefully, right now I'm just publishing articles and chapters out of this research, but hopefully, even what I've really been doing since we last spoke is having toddlers. So, but hopefully there'll be a second book that plays off of that term meditation sickness. The working title does. It's called Sick of Meditation, psychotherapists between religious experience and psychopathology. Psychotherapists adverse meditation effects between religious experience and psychopathology. And that's because part of the history of how therapists have responded to adverse meditation experiences, it goes back a little bit further. Well, the history I'm telling, it goes to the birth of the side disciplines themselves. But leaving that aside, before the meditation boom, there were therapists who were, already concerned about these kinds of experiences that people might have on a meditation retreat, where they do believe they have a direct line of communication to the divine, or maybe that they may have realized that they are a reincarnated bodhisattva themselves, or feel they've read about Buddhist emptiness, but now they feel just lost in emptiness. Um, and they likened those experiences to to the experiences that people were having, on psilocybin, or other kinds of what they called spiritual emergencies. And at that time, what they were encouraging was therapists to not pathologize what they believed were religious experiences, and said that they needed to be responded to as spiritual emergencies, as religious experiences, and that it was a different kind of cultural imperialism to reduce them to mental disorder, and they should be distinguished from that. And that was part of a larger movement that had significant effects to the side disciplines at institutional levels, and that's actually the chapter of the book I'm currently working on is on what's called the DSM, the manual that therapists use to diagnose people, was significantly affected, and that actually is where this project really started. Was a graduate student paper on the DSM, in this regard. So, okay. What that means, though, is you have some people, who are saying this may not be an adverse effect ultimately. This may be a positive religious experience. You have meditation teachers who, in ways big and small, will say that to their students. Will say, this is going to be uncomfortable, and that's how you know that it's productive and it's working. We need for those traumatic memories to surface, for you to be able to be truly freed from them. And this is a way of safely holding them. And it's maybe uncomfortable, and just it may be hard for a time, but you'll move through it. And so, and then you have the other side of that, where you have, meditators in distress is what, is a term for some of these folks that have come through this, and they'll say, having a meditation teacher say, just keep meditating through this was extremely painful and harmful to me.
Mm.
And side practitioners that express concern about that. So, but the point is that, like, it calls that into question. Defining whether something is an adverse effect or a positive effect is going to be determined by the kind of the worldview that it is being used to make that assessment. Um, and there's lots more to be there's a book length to more to be said about that.
What are you excited about in the next like 6 months to a year, like in with regards to this project? What are you looking forward to?
Well, hopefully, this piece on cultural appropriation will start moving through, and hopefully will be at least probably won't be out in 6 months, but who knows? We could hope. And I have another piece that also is under review. It was to the editors now that on informed consent and whether therapists ethical obligation to provide informed consent to people who come to see them for therapy includes informing them that mindfulness is religious, and that goes directly to what I was just sharing about, if these effects are positive because they're spiritual attainment because they're religious, you would need to disclose that to people. So I'm excited about that, and then I'm generally excited about trying to, continue, interviewing folks and speaking with folks, continuing to, see if this will come together as a book. I'm about halfway through what I've outlined for myself for the book, but it's been many years of working on this on and off. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Ira Helderman, I have loved having you back to talk about what you've been up to since Prescribing the Dharma, which is still available, by the way, from University of North Carolina Press. And I'm looking forward to seeing your future projects. And congratulations on working with the Templeton Working Group. That is so exciting. I have been talking to your whole cohort of scholars recently, and what a fabulous group with such a cool variety of research areas and interests. Where can people find you if they want to follow along with your upcoming projects?
Yeah, you can follow along at irahelderman.com is my website. I try to keep it up to date. It's probably not in this moment, but I will update it after we hang up.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Ira Helderman, thank you so much for joining me on a return visit to Classical Ideas. It's been a pleasure having you back.
Thanks so much.